Welcome to the Man Cave Podcast with Dan Casper.
He is Dr. Crow for Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine, joining us this morning. How you doing, Austin?
I'm doing great.
Atta boy. Hey, let's lead off with the NBA. So Porzingis, he had surgery. I know we talked about his injury. I'm not even going to try to repeat what that thing was called here this morning. But he did have surgery, and he's expected to return to play in 5 to 6 months, they said, which would go into the upcoming NBA season. Obviously, he's going to be out for the Olympics. But with this surgery and with this recovery, what's the prognosis typically for a full recovery and kind of back to his high level of play?
Yeah, again, this is a rare injury. I know we talked about that last time. There is a very similar injury in the outer side of the ankle, so I'll take the word for you here. It's a retinaculum. So again, the retinaculum is basically a covering that helps the tendon glide in the correct path. So on the outer part of the ankle, the peroneal tendons are very commonly injured with people who have repeated ankle sprains. So you get what's called peroneal subluxation, and that's from a lateral retinacular injury. We see those commonly. Medial side, in fact, I don't know if I've seen one in my career where you have the posterior tibial tendon or there's a couple other tendons that run through there. That same thing, it's a retinaculum, so it's the same kind of covering, and that injury is there. So point being, I guess you could probably say it's going to be similar to a lateral retinacular injury and repair because those are successful. So the answer, if it's acting like that, it should have a pretty high likelihood that he gets back fully. But again, it is uncommon, so it's probably a little bit less predictable. But I would guess he bounces back pretty well from that.
You know, with the Olympics coming up here, and especially staying with basketball, given how we're all about load management now, or at least the NBA teams are about load management, do you think it's a little surprising that maybe some teams are still maybe not trying to close the door on some of these guys going to the Olympics and playing in that because they don't want them to get injured?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you look at the kind of big picture, Olympics are huge, right? So, I mean, it's a chance for an athlete to represent their country. So I'm sure it's important, and there probably is some back and forth on that. I mean, there have been teams that have said that to their athletes, we don't want you doing it. But at the end of the day, I don't think they really can control, unless they had something written specifically in their contract, I don't think they could really control them doing that. But, I mean, there are guys who are going to get injured, let's be honest. I mean, it's going to be exposure to athletics, and injuries happen with that. Whether it's acute injuries or overuse injuries, those are all things. And it's really clearly very much shortens the off season for them. I mean, it's really going to be they're going to be playing almost year-round basketball.
Right.
So, yeah, you look at it and say that's probably going to be a potential detriment. But I think some of these athletes probably consider the Olympics to be, darn near as important as the NBA season for them. It's, only every 4 years. It's your whole country you're representing. I mean, I think all kids kind of grow up wanting to win a gold medal for their country. So it's something that I think probably is pretty high on their list of things they want to do.
Right. To baseball here with going to the Brewers here. So Devin Williams, we know the All-Star closer back in March. It was announced he was out with stress fractures in his back. And we haven't seen him yet, although it sounds like this week he's going to do some bullpen work, and they're hoping at the end of July. Now, he had stress fractures on the left and right sides of his T12 vertebrae. This was back in March, and they're hoping maybe at the end of July. Is that a kind of a typical timeline, or is that a little bit longer here because he didn't have surgery with this? Yeah.
Surgery is usually not required for that. So what it is you have the areas of the spine that kind of load with the posterior part called the facets, and so in between the facets there's a little area called the pars. And so that pars sees a lot of stress. So it is relatively common. So not that stress fractures in the back are rare, but if they do happen, they virtually always happen in the pars. So we see that. So looking at the timeline, that makes sense because you need it to heal, and then really you also have to look at the mechanics that put you in that spot in the first place. So they probably are going to try to work on that as well. So it's going to be a combined recovery, if you will, to get him back to take care of the acute injury and then also hopefully help prevent any recurrence.
With stress fractures is there any, you just mentioned repeat occurrence, is there a concern about, that happening when it comes to stress fractures, especially when you don't have surgery to correct those?
In a lot of parts of the body, once they resolve, they're gone. But I will say we sometimes see PARS injuries recur in younger athletes, and that's a little bit different. The PARS injuries for young athletes tend to be in the lower lumbar spine. His was, I believe, in the thoracic spine, which is a pretty atypical place to get it, to be honest with you. But it really has to do with, again, these kind of stresses that are repeatedly applied to the back, which clearly in this case is from throwing. So there's something with his mechanics that are doing that. So, it's like a golfer and changing their golf swing. I don't think you can always just snap your finger and be like, change, right? So for a pitcher to be like, just throw differently, that's probably a tall order. So I think in this case, there probably is some concern for recurrence. So they're really likely going to push it to say, get it fully healed and then make some adjustment to either rehab protocols or the actual throwing mechanics.
We had a texter a little bit earlier wanted me to ask you this. I know it's something we've kind of touched on in the past, but generally this texter had asked about your thoughts on what seems like an increase in pitcher injuries this year. And I know we kind of talked about that off and on, and there's been some reporting on that and such, and trying to figure it out if it's the pitch clock that's causing that and such. But I mean, is it just simply as to kind of revisit it, guys throwing harder and throwing more of a variety of pitches that put a little bit more wear and tear on their elbows and shoulders?
I think that really sums it up nicely. I mean, to me, it's the velocity and the speed that they're throwing. The pitch clock, I don't know. I mean, I just don't see how a couple extra seconds of recovery is really going to make a radical difference in these injuries. I mean, so could it play a role? I guess. I mean, at some point they're going to, once they have enough data, they'll look at this. I mean, I promise you there's being research on it right now. They're looking at injury rates, and of course, there's always statistical variance. So you go season to season, there's seasons where there's a lot, and there's seasons where there's not a lot. And it doesn't always mean something's changed, just that's some natural ebb and flow. That's how statistics work. So it is possible just seeing a blip. And the other thing is, often if it's a more notable athlete that's injured, it certainly draws your attention. So it brings to the forefront of your kind of thoughts. And so then it's like, wow, we're seeing a lot of them. So I don't know if the data actually suggests that there is more or not. Maybe there is. But to me, I think the overall trend is that pitchers are just throwing harder and harder and harder. And at the youth level, it's also just year-round play. And that's why there's been this huge spike over the past decade plus, especially UCL injuries in the elbow for young athletes. So these teenager pitchers it's just because they're throwing 9 months of the year, things like that. So that is the one benefit in the upper Midwest here is we have seasons, and that does tend to nip that a little bit, but there's indoor teams and practices, and so we do see that. So I'm a big advocate for 3-sport athletes just because you simply work different parts of the body and can give the body rest, and it's just a little bit healthier way to approach it.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, Jason Kelce, to kind of wrap some things up here this morning, he did an interview, and he kind of talked about all the different injuries he suffered throughout his career. He said, quote, "Everybody exits the league with some type of impediment. I've had twice reconstructed right knee, a surgery on my hand, my groin, broken toes. I've had my share of things that have gone wrong, not to mention just the wear and tear of playing 13 years in the NFL." For a guy like that who played offensive lineman, tush push, and, he was at the center of it all, pun intended with the position, I guess. But,
yeah.
But, when we talk about these football players and the types of injuries that they go or suffer in surgeries, are they increased for stuff like arthritis, maybe as they get older, or what are some of the other negative side effects from all these injuries that they suffered that could it come back to bite them as they get a little bit older?
The answer is absolutely. And it's twofold. So the first one would be actual injuries. So anytime you injure a joint, there's a level of inflammation that occurs. That's not good for the joint. Certainly if you have a surgery or a fracture that goes to the joint, then you're really increasing the risk of what's called post-traumatic arthritis. So yes, injuries do impart extra stress and damage to joints. And then what they're trying to do with their bodies, I mean, they're 300, or in his case, a 300 plus pound guy trying to push around other 300 plus pound guys. So that puts extra wear and tear. And then lastly, just simply the size of these human beings. So if you look at anyone that big, they're also going to be putting more stress on their body. So they're just innately, so even if they weren't a pro athlete, if they're that big, there's a correlation with size and arthritic conditions as well. So you look at it, and I mean, there are a lot of pro athletes that are getting joints replaced or have some level of, debilitation related to those kind of things, the quote wear and tear, or just, again, post-traumatic arthritis related to joint injuries. So there's no question that they put their bodies on the line and they do pay the price. I mean, they're obviously rewarded handsomely financially, a lot of them, but not all. I mean, there are guys who, just try to fight through the league, and they're the ones who are left in a tough spot where it's like their bodies took the hit, but they just didn't get the payday at the end. And so I know there's been a push for increasing some of the insurance funds and things like that for injured athletes, and I think that's important to remember, that they definitely have a much higher incidence of those kind of things. So it's multifactorial for sure, but guys who've had, certainly, for example, his knee that's had 2 reconstructive surgeries, that knee has a pretty high likelihood at some point in his life of developing significant arthritis in it.
So last question, when we see these guys, I'm thinking like Larry McCarron or other dudes whose fingers are like sideways with that. Is that because they didn't get it fixed, or is that just, and why can't they get it fixed now? You know what I mean? That might be a dumb question, but like, why can't Larry McCarron get his finger fixed so it's not sideways and creeping everybody out when he holds it up?
It is intense, isn't it? The answer is generally those did begin with neglect of an injury. So it certainly doesn't always start like that, whether it's like either chronically dislocated or sublux joint. But often it'll be kind of more mild, and then they play through and it gets worse and worse. And so a lot of those injuries, if you don't treat them acutely, there's not a lot of great late reconstructive options other than fusion. So the answer to that would be to fuse that joint, and that would work well. Then he just wouldn't have motion through that joint. But it's pretty well tolerated in the fingers, actually, because you have so many knuckles, and so the joints around it or the knuckles around it can compensate. So fusions in the finger do pretty well, but it's surgery. And the interesting thing is often that's not very painful. You look at it and it must be like, how in the world can that guy even do anything? But I've seen a number of patients who have fingers like that, and they're just kind of like, that's the way it is. It's not as bad as you think. Now, eventually they will start developing wear in that joint, and that's when they'll often say, okay, fine, now that it hurts, I'm going to do something about it. But yeah, the answer is they could get it fused at any point and that would straighten it right on out. But at this point, it's probably a bit of a party trick for them too.
Well, and then I was wondering, is it like almost a badge of honor, like wrestlers with like cauliflower ear, over there?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, cauliflower ear, that's boxers, wrestlers, MMA, they get it. If they're treated appropriately, you never get it. But it is a bit of a badge of honor that they often will neglect it for the reason to actually have it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think guys are doing that with their fingers necessarily, but at this point, yeah, I mean, he certainly could have it addressed. He just is electing not to. It's his choice, of course.
Right, exactly. He's Dr. Crow, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine. Dude, appreciate the time as always. Have a very, very good 4th of July weekend next week, buddy. Enjoy it. Have fun on the golf course, and we'll catch up with you soon, okay?
Absolutely. You take care.
You got it. Dr. Crow, inside the training room, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine.